right, good morning. How are we? All right. Well, good morning again. I'm going to get some loudness in it. Let's do it. Golly, y'all let me down. All right. And we'll do it again. No, just 1, 2, 3. Good morning. There we go. You guys are alive now. So that song is sometimes, it's just neat to really think about what a song says in it and why it's important for us in our faith. But this song, it sings about, bones and singing and dry bones and stuff like that. And then, breath in our lungs. We're going through the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. We're in the process of doing that. And really, if you think about this last song that we just sung, it really is God's breath in our lungs, not just metaphorically, but literally. In Genesis, he breathed into us, right? The spirit that hovered, like God speaks and breathes into us and gives us life, like the very breath in every human person to have ever lived and that will ever live is worthy of tremendous value because of their image bearer status. But like when we really think about that, also just from the perspective of the very breath, no matter what they are, like where they are, where they're from, physical limitations, ethnicities, like any of these things, nationalities, whatever. Listen, all of us, all of humanity has tremendous value and worth and have been implanted with the very breath of God in their lungs. And that alone should be something that causes us to look at the other person on the other side of us as worthy of compassion, love, patience, care, dignity, and respect. And we get to sing about that. That's just neat, right? We sing about that to remind us that the person on the other side, the person that cut you off, even they, right, are worthy of dignity and respect after a couple of hand gestures, right? Hand gestures aside, people are worth something. And the Bible reminds us of that, and the songs that we sing remind us of that. And not because of anything that they bring to the table necessarily. It's not value because you have something to gain, but value because God has given us something already. You see, people's value is not in what they can give you. Their value and worth is because it's been established from someone that actually has the capability to establish worth. The God of the universe has said, valuable. And we get to read about that every single week. Anyways, it has nothing to do with today's sermon. But that's what you get. My name's Wes. I'm one of the pastors here. And is it hot or cold in here? Let's just get a survey. Just right in the middle. See, guys, listen, you get here early enough, you get in the middle, you're fine. That's the trick. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm going to adjust one side up a degree, and we'll see how it levels out. What do we think? I'm naturally good with cold weather. The sunlight's my enemy. So... just part of it. All right, we'll see how this plays out. We're figuring this thing out. We're trying some things. If you are cold, all right. All right, so let's recall what we got, and then we're going to go to a time of prayer and get ready for today's sermon. I'm getting older, so I brought glasses this time, but if I put these on, I can't see you because you're blurry, but I can see and read. So we'll see which one, comes into play here in just a minute. Last week, up to this point, we've gone through from Genesis up to 1 Samuel chapter 16. That led us from the creation of the universe to the Exodus story, which we talked about and recapped last week. So I'm not going to go into that this week. But this week, we're going to recap just a bit of what we talked about last week. We talked about a guy. Anyone remember his name? If you weren't here last week, you get a pass. Right? Saul, we did talk about Saul. Saul comes into play in today's story. Who is the book Samuel, right? Okay, and then what did Samuel do last week? Does anybody want to go for it? David. He anointed David as king. Yeah, David, if you remember, was the 8th born out of his family, which is really weird. Not that the 8 kids is weird. The fact that he was anointed king as the 8th born of his family, because in this culture, right, the person of importance wasn't kid number 8, it was kid number 1. They would get a double portion of the inheritance, the blessing, like all of these cultural things, and yet through this, God went and he picked the least of these to say, I'm going to do something special with this kid. And that's David. David was a shepherd, right? And we'll pick up a little bit from his shepherd tendencies of guarding sheep. That's what shepherds do, if you didn't know, right? All right, so let's just kind of keep that in our mind. He was a youngster, the least likely to be a hero, and he was picked as king as the 8th round selection of Samuel, because Samuel actually went through every brother first. And then God kept saying, no, not that guy. I've got someone else. And here comes the shepherd boy. The outcast, if you really think about it culturally, because guess where shepherds had to hang out when it came out to the city and to the temple? They were not really welcomed, would be an easy way to say, right? And yet this is going to be the future king of Israel. And let's just be real. Anyone here that hasn't grown up in church has probably at least heard people reference King David or David of Israel, or that little star, that Jewish people may wear. That is the star of David, right? Yeah, it's kind of a big deal, right? David. So this guy, the last pick, a big deal. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to go to a time of prayer, but I want to set the table for our prayer because like I told you last week, again, if you weren't here, you missed out on this, you just get a guess. Tim, right? I've been giving Tim a hard time this morning, but that's because I love Tim. Last week it was Alyssa. All right, so here we go. We're going to approach our time of prayer with the normal stuff in mind, but I want to set the table because the way we're doing prayer right now for the pre-sermon prayer anyways, is, wow, when I did that, it went really deep. We're going to take time to be silent. We're going to take time to just really think, and here's what I want you to go through. Life has a unique way of hitting us with a wrecking ball. You can have a perfectly fine Tuesday, and you're one phone call away from a total disaster of a week. Go to the doctor, you have some blood work done, and they call you. Right? Because if the doctor doesn't call, that's usually what? Good, right? Or they just forgot your number. But you get a call on a Tuesday, and it says it's cancer. Or your boss calls and says, we're having some cutbacks. Or your spouse says there's someone else. I mean, phone calls can do tremendous damage to the trajectory of our week, right? But it's not just that kind of stuff either. Because some of the hardest and most difficult scenarios that I go through circumstantially aren't from phone calls or text messages or emails, but they're internal. Moments where I'm silent by myself and I'm reminded of the traumas of my past or reminded of the failures of my present. When we approach this time of silence before we go into the sermon, I would just ask you to do this with me. To allow those moments as they bubble up, and even ask God silently, God, reveal in me the places where I need healing, where I need hope, where I need help, where I can find life. Because I think each and every one of us at least have some places in our lives where traumas are very real internally, where we're held back, where we're damaged or where we're hurting, or maybe we just don't even know how to have help. So I would just ask that we go into this one moment and we just ask God, reveal in me what might keep me from experiencing joy and delight fully in who you are. Jesus said, all who are weary and heavy laden, come to me, and I will give you rest. And I really believe maybe some of you have experienced that rest and live in that rest, and I am so, so happy for you. But there are moments in my life where I don't always live in rest and in peace. And there have been other places where rest and peace in my life were completely perceived as unattainable because they were just a myth to me. I feel like God has worked enough in my life now that I have experienced that, and I still experience that from times. But there are other times where I let the circumstances of my life, the phone calls on a Tuesday, or the buried thoughts and repressed pains in my heart rob me of peace and rest. So here's what I'm asking you to do, church. I'm asking you to take a moment as we're quiet to just say, God, here I am, all of who I am, the good, the bad, and the ugly, the hurting, the helpless, and the hopeless. Will you help me? And that's it. And just allow the silence to bring those things to mind, and then let's see what God's Word has in store for us. Is that good? We good with that? All right. Let's pray. So the reason I do that is one, I'm just going to keep doing this. So, if you really weren't here last week, like I said, I'm going on a bit of a journey myself. I believe God is really working on me on doing some real healing in my life and moving in my life. And and I feel like I'm in a good place. Like, I don't mean it to sound like I'm just so jacked up that you guys really should never listen to me. But instead, what I'm saying is I believe that God has this continual process of moving in our lives and changing us and helping us and growing us and moving in us, right? And so this week, in practicing just really being quiet and letting God speak into my heart and revealing me, what is it, God, that keeps me from seeing how great you are? What is it that prevents me from rest, right? What he has brought into my mind this week is the image of my son, right? Hudson. He's 6, and he's a sweet kid. My daughter's a sweet kid too, don't get me wrong, but it's Hudson that's kind of been on my mind this week. And in thinking about Hudson, I think about all the times where he'll come up and typically he wants candy, I guess, is really what he mostly wants. But I also most of the time just say, yeah, buddy, you can have all the candy you want. I don't care, right? Mommy's putting you to bed tonight. It's fine. I give him candy, or he'll want to play or be tickled, or we'll go outside and play ball, or he'll want to tell me some kind of story, or all of this. But anytime he comes up to me, I think of all of these times where all I want to do is just say yes and love him. And that image, I really believe God has put in my heart, because this is really what God is like for you and for us. On a much grander and better level. I'm imperfect because I'm human. But God sees you as the children and the people that he loves. And he sees me in this way, to where there's nothing about you that he looks at and says, I would love you, but. No, Hudson in his imperfect 6-year-old stuff, right? He never picks up his shoes. He leaves toys everywhere. You'll find yogurt, the little Go-Gurt packs. Anybody else find these randomly, oh, great, under a cabinet? And how'd this get under an ottoman? First off, he can't pick an ottoman up. How did he get the yogurt wrapper under the ottoman, right? All of these things where you could just be I could pick this apart of all the reasons I should be angry at you. I'm not saying that we don't get upset or frustrated. What I'm saying is none of those things diminish my love for him. So your baggage, my baggage, the things that came into your mind in this moment where you stopped to think, this is what God has been speaking to me this week, I love you fully. It'll never get less, and it can't get more because it's already full. Full to the extent that there is no capability to love you more, because in all my godness, that's how much I love you. That's how much he loves you. So in all those things, in those wounds where they were bubbling up, and the memories where you were thinking, I just need you to hear this, that God loves you. He's with you, and that'll never change, no matter what your story is. Loves you fully. He's for you. All right, so in 2 Samuel chapter 17, we're going to start now. You've got the backstory. We've prayed. Now let's see what this is. This is a cool story, and most of us, even if we've never read the Bible, never been to church, we have heard this story referenced in some form or another. If you watch any kind of sports, whenever an underdog faces a very legendary type team, right? A UK versus Alabama, because they're underdogs. Football, we can talk about it, but not like an App State plays a Michigan, right? Is that too close to home? I heard it. No, yeah. But you know what I'm saying? It's like when these small schools take on a big school, or whenever that like Oklahoma City takes on the Lakers, or like you have a David and Goliath story, right? Anybody familiar with this? Even if you've never gone to church, we've heard, oh yeah, it's like a David and Goliath. We're going to watch this fight. It's like a David and Goliath, or you know what I'm saying, right? We know this story. So anyways, it was kind of a hard sermon to prepare for, because it's like, how do we teach on something that's so well known? But we're going to give it a shot, and hopefully it comes in handy. We're not going to read the whole chapter, because there's like 58 verses, and you can thank me for that. But what I will say is you should definitely go back and read the story, because it's pretty amazing. So let's start in verse 2 of chapter 17, and I want us to see something that's pretty neat that happens, okay? So we're going to go 2 through 11, and we're going to talk about it for just a moment, and then we're going to keep on rolling. So who was it? Lyle, you mentioned a minute ago, the first character we talked about from last week was Saul. So here's Saul. Saul was the king of Israel, just as a side note. Saul was a bit of a disappointing king. Started out great, finished poorly. Yet again, another little object lesson for us as people, right? You can start very well, but end very poorly. Instead, we are called to run the race all the way to the finish. So listen, men, women, kids, listen, it's not just how you start, but how you finish actually matters. So we want to keep the right pace. So Saul and the men of Israel, this is the people of God, the nation of God, and Saul is their king. They gathered and they camped in the Valley of Elah, and they lined up in battle formation to face the Philistines. The Philistines were, the Israelites we've been reading up to this point, from the Exodus going into the Promised Land. Now they're kind of in the Promised Land. They're still working on their conquest of the Promised Land, and the Philistines were an opposing pagan nation that stood in opposition to Israel. And here we are about to have a face-off. And the Philistines are standing on one hill, and the Israelites are on another, and there was a ravine in between them. And then there was a champion named Goliath from Gath, and he came out from the Philistine camp, and he was 9 feet, 9 inches tall, slightly taller than me. And he wore a bronze helmet and a bronze scale armor that weighed 125 pounds, slightly less than me. And then, but more than Bobby. I'm just kidding. He's 126 pounds. There was a bronze armor on his shins and a bronze javelin that was slung between his shoulders, and his spear shaft was like a weaver's beam, and the iron point of his spear weighed 15 pounds. And in addition, a shield bearer was walking in front of him. And just as a side note, from 4 to 7, what this really sums up to is this is one big dude. All right? I mean, impressive. Not just tall, big, strong dude. I mean, the clothing he was wearing was over 125 pounds. Think about this. Big, strong dude. All right. He stood, and then this big, strong dude stood, and he shouted to the Israel or the Israelite battle formations, and he says, why do you come out to line up in battle formation? He asked them, am I not a Philistine? Are you not servants of Saul? Choose one of your men, have him come down and fight against me. And if he wins in a fight against me and he kills me, then we will be your servants. But if I win against him and kill him, then you will be our servants and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the ranks of Israel today. Send a man so we can fight each other. And listen to this verse. When Saul and all Israel heard these words from the Philistine, they lost their courage and were terrified. Now, here's what's really intriguing about this. In verses 1 through 3, and you can partner with verse 11 to kind of just come to this logical thread. In 1 through 3, the Israelites were not afraid. I want you to think about this. It doesn't mention that they're afraid. In fact, if you go with verse 11, it says they lost their courage and were terrified, right? To have lost something means you had to have had it, right? So the Israelites had courage. They were ready to fight. They were there to fight. They were purposed to fight this people. And in verse 4 is the Tuesday phone call that changes every aspect of their perspective. Because in verse 4, there was a giant that comes out and he challenges them. And you can fast forward to verses 11. When they heard this guy, they lost their courage and were terrified. You see, Goliath was huge. He was terrifying. He was intimidating. And the Israelites, you got to remember, all the way up to this point into this promised land, they were the people of God, the nation that God had chosen, right? These were the lineage of Abraham. These are the people that worshiped Yahweh, the living God, that had been a pillar of fire and a pillar of smoke. They had brought quail up and manna and split seas and brought plagues and defeated enemies and tore down walls. Like, this is the God that they serve. And they came out courageous, ready to fight, and then this big dude speaks, and they lost their courage, and they lost their faith, and they were overwhelmed by their circumstances. Can anyone else relate? Like when God has moved in mighty ways in your life, and you can see where God has moved in mighty ways, but then that one little moment, gas prices go up to $4.59 a gallon, and we start to freak out and lose our minds. Or we get a phone call, or you lose a loved one, and we become overwhelmed by the circumstances around everything else that is outside of our control. You see, this Philistine was outside of the Israelite control, but they also forgot that God was still ultimately the one that was in control. They saw the circumstance, and they lost their courage and were afraid. And I firmly believe that I can relate with them, because I can see my circumstances and sometimes be overwhelmed by them. I mean, they had experienced amazing things of God, but it's also a reminder of us that even the bravest of men are no more than what God has made them. You see, that quote from last week continues to come up in my mind, that without God we cannot, but without us God will not. We are fully dependent on God for everything that we are about to accomplish in our lives and in the lives of other people. We exist to help others follow Jesus. That is our purpose, to glorify God, to make much of His name, and to do that through making disciples. And God has a plan for us, but honestly, it's really daunting and kind of scary when we think about it, right? But God has given us something larger than the circumstances. He has given us Himself. The circumstances can be intimidating, because what if they reject me? What if this happens? What if they don't like me? What if? But what if God is the one that we look to as larger than our circumstances? And we actually get to see someone that does that here in just a moment. So they were afraid because there was a guy that came in verse 4 that changes their perspective. They had lost their vision of who God is and what God has done, and instead now see everything through the lens of a giant that has called them out and wants to fight them. But on a high level, this is what we know. There was this guy. His name was David. You haven't seen him come into the scene yet, but we're going to skip a lot of verses, so I'm going to give you a quick backfill. From verse 12 on to where we're going to pick up, David was actually watching his sheep while his brothers were fighting with the army. You see, 3 of his brothers were with the Israelite army at this camp, and David is over here tending sheep for his father, and his dad says, hey, go and take some food to your brothers and give this to one of the generals, and then come back and just tell me how it's going. So David leaves his sheep. He leaves his field. They hire a, roaming shepherd to come and watch the sheep so that he can go and do what his daddy has asked him to do. And he shows up and he gets there to get this update, and he meets them. And it's in verse 31 where we start to see a little bit of color to it, because here's David. The giant has already came out, said some stuff. They hear some stuff. David's listening to it. He's engaging in some conversation. In verse 31, it picks it up, and it says, what David said was overheard and reported to Saul. So he had David brought to him. Saul is who again? There we go. We got to stay awake here. We'll turn the heat up and cook everybody out. No, wait, that'll put you to sleep. We'll turn it down again. David goes to Saul. Saul has him brought to him. And David says to Saul, hey, don't let anyone be discouraged by him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine. Just remember, like this whole way, the giant comes out and says, hey, I want to throw down right quick. Send me your champion. And we have now roughly 20-something verses of every one of the Israelites up to this point. These are trained warriors, fighters, battle-proven, and they are shaking in their boots. And this shepherd boy comes, hears this guy speak, and it says, hey, nobody fear. Underdog is here. All right? I'm ready. I've got this. And then here's what happens. Saul replies, the king, you can't go fight this Philistine. You're just a youth. And he's been warring. He's been a warrior since he was young. David is immediately met with skepticism. David comes into the scene believing that God is not going to be dishonored by this giant. I'm ready to fight. And then here's David saying, I'm ready to go, man. Send me. I got you. I got you. And Saul says, bro, you can't fight. You're a kid. And that dude is legit. Right? Like this guy is going to kill you. Skepticism comes in. Doubt comes in. But you see, this is why perspective really, really matters. It matters because the army and the king, they see the circumstances that this giant is a proven warrior. He is strong. He is terrible. He is terrifying. And they reap doubt and anxiety and instability. And remember, they were brave in the first 3 verses. So these are not cowards by nature, but these were cowards by circumstance. And then in verse 4, when it transitions to this, the army leans into the circumstance and receives what they get out of it. But David comes in, he sees the circumstance, and he recognizes that there's something people are missing, that God is greater than our circumstance. I am not afraid of this giant because guess what? Our God will not be defeated. I will stand before anyone. And you come to find out, he even gives a story about fighting lions and bears, and he beats them with his bare hands because even then he believed and trusted in the God that said he would do great things. There's also a little piece of this where you got to ask the question is, how much of it did David really grasp from a faith perspective? He was already anointed to be the future king of Israel, yet he wasn't one. Do you just think that maybe David took God at his word and thought, well, if I'm dead, I probably won't make it to king status. And since God said I would be a king and the king of this country, 2 things are true or have to be true. I will not die, and this country will not be defeated. My people will persevere because God has made a promise. And David was leaning into the promise of something that he has yet to see. Kind of like a theme here in the Bible. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, like all of these, leaning into the promise that they may never even see. And David getting into the promise that he will see and trusting God to fulfill it even at the feet of a 9'9" man, ready, battle-hardened to kill a youth. David encourages the people. Listen to this. This is just neat. And then again, there's another part of it. It's like, you're just a kid. Why are you telling me this? But David is so on point when he said it. He says to the king, and he even says it to the people, don't be discouraged. Don't be afraid. Don't worry about your circumstances. Listen, your circumstances will be taken care of. God is faithful. He will provide. Whatever the circumstance ends up with, whatever goes on in this, don't be discouraged because you have an advocate. I'm going to go for you. You don't have to be afraid of the giant because I'm going to handle this. This will come into play a little bit later. So skip on over to verse 40 and let's just see how this plays out, and then we'll pick up pretty quickly. Verse 40 says, so let me fill in the gap real quick before he goes. Saul, hearing David's plea, says, all right, bro, you got this. It was a little different in the old language, but that's how I translate it. He said, bro, sweet, you can fight this guy. And he tries to give him all this armor and all these things. And really, go back and read this. This is a great story if you've never read it. But in the short version of it, David goes with just the stuff that he brought, his shepherd's staff, his sling, and his shepherd bag, which is basically something he'd carry his lunch in. So you can imagine like a little pouch for some snacks. And he goes and he gets some stones. And in verse 40, it talks about it. He said he took his staff in his hand. He chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi, which is basically like a creek. And he put them in the pouch in the shepherd's bag. And then with his sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine. This little, probably 20-year-old something guy. I mean, he really wasn't tiny. Like we talk about David, like he's like a 10-year-old weighing about a buck 10. Actually, a pretty tough 10-year-old, buck 10, right? Never mind. Yeah. Sorry, yeah. 65-pound, 10-year-old. Like, this is still probably a pretty impressive guy based on the way the story reads, okay? So, probably look like a beast like me is the way I would image it, right? Look just, stud. Philistine came closer and closer to David and the shield bearer in front of him. And the Philistine looked and he saw David and he despised him because he was just a youth. He was healthy and handsome. And he said to David, am I a dog that you come against me with sticks? And he cursed David by his gods, and he said, come here, the Philistine called to David. I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts. And David said to the Philistine, you come against me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of the Armies, the God of the ranks of Israel. You have defied him, and today the Lord will hand you over to me. Today I will strike you down and remove your head and give the corpses of the Philistine camp to the birds of the sky and the wild creatures of the earth. Then all the world will know that Israel has a God, and this whole assembly will know that it is not by sword or by spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will hand you over to us. That's pretty intense. Some good smack talk, some good trash talk, and just to give a little bit of historical information on this was actually a cultural normal circumstance. Whenever they would get into this fight and 2 champions would come and face off each other, they usually had a round of smack talk. It was like WWE on steroids. Instead of, I'm going to break your arm, it's, birds are going to eat your flesh, bro. I'm going to cut your head off, right? So, and this is just, culturally, this is normal. There's a big difference between what Goliath says and what David says, though. You see, Goliath is offended, and he says, look at what I'm about to do to you. And David takes this pious approach, and he comes forth and says, it's not me that you're facing, and it's not me that you are disrespecting. You have defied the God of Israel. And today, he has handed you over to me. And I am going to do this because he is the one worthy of glory and honor and worship. And it is God and God alone that gives the victor the victory. David reminds not only us today of what everything is about and who it is that puts the breath in our lungs, but he also reminds his brothers in the camp behind him of, guys, you all have lost faith and courage, but be strong, because it is God's victory, and He will not fail our nation, because He has called us, He has chosen us, and He has promised us, and we will see that day, and we will see that promise. So take heart, men, because I am leaning into this battle knowing that the God of the universe is about to do something amazing. And in verse 48, we pick it up. When the Philistine started forward to attack him, so you can imagine, here's this 9-foot man walking with his sword, with his javelin, and then you got this other dude over here carrying his shield, walking toward this youth. David ran quickly. David didn't flinch. David didn't pause. David didn't hesitate. David ran to the battle line to meet the Philistine. We don't have to run from our fears, guys. We don't have to run from the things that are coming at us. We don't run from our circumstances. We run to, knowing that God is with us regardless of the outcome. We step forward knowing that God is faithful. The apostles did it, even when it led them to martyrdom. The early church did it. And I think one of the failures of the church today is that we run from our circumstances most of the time instead of toward them. We have nothing to be afraid of or ashamed of, church. We have the greatest story ever told. The greatest king to ever serve. And the God that speaks life into existence. We can run toward anything and not worry. Anyways, David put his hand in his bag, he took out a stone and he slung it and he hit the Philistine in the forehead. And you got to remember, this is pretty impressive. This isn't like, dude was big, but his forehead wasn't like a billboard. He had a helmet on. Remember, he had armor on, 125 pounds worth of armor, which means when you think about the armor of the day, there was a little spot right here in which a stone could hit. David ran, slung a stone. And here's the thing. We can talk about, man, he was so accurate. He was probably the greatest stone slinger of the world, 4-time champion. I don't know. I don't know if any of that's true. What I do know is that in a battle situation, knowing that your life is on the line, you running now with an elevated cardio level, your heartbeat is faster, your breathing is elevated, and the moving target, to hit something like this is not just purely accuracy, but really a God-intervened moment, to where God allows something to happen and moves for something to happen, to set into place the next set of steps that we're going to see. And listen to this. Here's what happens. A stone slung it, hit him, and the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down with a sling, face down to the ground. And David defeated the Philistine with a sling and a stone. And David overpowered the Philistine and killed him without having a sword. Because remember, what did he have in his hands? Shepherd's staff, a sling, a bag, 5 rocks. Okay? Now listen to this. He ran over and stood over him, and he grabbed the Philistine's sword. This is how we can say David probably wasn't some little bitty kid, but pretty Wesley shaped. And he pulled it from his sheath, the Philistine sword, which this guy was how tall? 9 foot 9 inches. His armor was what? He didn't carry a shield because guess what? He was already weighed down with everything else. This sword would have been massive. And David pulls it out, and he cuts off his head. And the Philistines saw that their hero was dead. They fled, and the men of Israel and Judah rallied, and they shouted their battle cry, and they chased the Philistines to the entrance of the valley, the gates of Ekron, and the bodies of the Philistines were strewn along the Shaaraim road to Gath and Ekron. What's amazing is, in this story, the stone threw him down, and it knocked him out, but he was still alive. But it was the sword of Goliath in which David used to ultimately kill and defeat and fulfill what he said was going to happen, that I'm going to cut your head off. He used his sword. And it's really like an illusion, right? We're going to talk about this here a little bit more in just a second, but this is an illusion, right? Because here's the thing. God is greatly glorified in this moment by the actual storyline of Goliath's very own sword being used to defeat the giant. And it reminds us of something that's going to happen a little bit later, when the very device in which Satan and Pharisees and Rome and religious leaders thought would end the movement of God through this man that walked on the planet named Jesus when they hung him to a cross. But it was through that very cross in which sin and death was ultimately defeated. God is most glorified through this moment because he took the very instrument that the world would say defeated him to ultimately redeem and resolve every sense of tension from brokenness that started in the garden. Just like David took the very sword and defeated the enemy. That's pretty cool. Now, what we know, and this is when we'll start wrapping up, okay? What we know is this. There's this definition, right, of type. And David is essentially a type of this Christology. So here you're going to get some textbook stuff real quick. David is a type. What is a type? A word type is generally used to denote a resemblance between something present, something future, which is called the antitype. Why does this matter? Because I think I've told you this a few times, but really the Old Testament, I love it. It's so exciting because we get to see all these places throughout the Old Testament where there is a type that is pointing toward an antitype. The ultimate antitype that we're talking about is really Jesus. And there is a type. David is a type that points towards something that would come later. This something or someone is actually Jesus himself. And let me show you a few ways in which we see this. In many ways, David interceded on Israel's behalf, right? Can we see that? What did David do? He came in. They were afraid. They were defeated. They had lost all confidence and courage. They were sitting before this one overwhelming circumstance and obstacle to do what God has called them into the land of promise and rest, to really live in it. And David says, hey, take heart, because I have this. It's a foreshadowing of a greater intercession to come, in which Jesus would come into the scene some few thousand years later, and he would step in and say, hey, you don't have to be afraid anymore. You don't have to be in prison anymore. You don't have to be defined by the way the world has defined you anymore. Instead, I step into your place. Take courage, because I'm here. I will die in your place. I will live in your place. I have come to take your place. Jesus is the ultimate intercession, and David is a type that points to him. Not only that, listen to this. David was born where? Where is he from? Bethlehem. Who else was born in Bethlehem? Jesus. Yet again, another pointing forward. Okay, what was David doing before he came to the battle lines? He was shepherding. What did Jesus say about shepherds in referring to himself? He said, I am the good shepherd. You see this? This is what I'm telling you, the Old Testament is so good. It's like candy, but better. No cavities. Goliath is a type. He represents an impossible barrier to overcome, just like sin and a broken relationship with God is insurmountable on your own. The fact is you can't defeat this giant any more than the Israelites could. You can't defeat sin. You can't defeat death. You can't overcome these things on your own or through your good works. You won't be lovable enough just because of all the things you do. Like you can't clean yourself up enough. That's why we say church isn't a place for just clean people. It's a place for real people with real problems and real life and real scenarios and real baggage, because Jesus, what we talked about last week in Matthew, he said that I didn't come for the healthy, I came for the sick. The sick are who needs a doctor. I didn't come for the righteous, but for the sinners. Listen, we can't defeat this stuff on our own. The Goliath represents our brokenness. And then David does the impossible through God's divine provision, another sense of the type. But Jesus is ultimately the divine provision that defeats sin and through whom our restoration for fellowship of God will ultimately come. You see, David is a type that points to a future story, and Israel was always looking forward for the promise that was about to happen. And listen, we get to look back to the promise that was fulfilled, but we also still get to look forward for the promise that is still coming, which is ultimately we get to be with God in His presence as His children fully, face to face. We will see Him one day, and that is a promise that was fulfilled when we look back to the antitype that we can look forward to from the story of David and Goliath, because we were looking forward to what Jesus is about to do, and now we look back to what Jesus has already done. And why is that important? Because here is the reality, is whatever our story, whatever our baggage, whatever is going on in our world, the reality is this: whatever brokenness you have, it has been redeemed through Christ. Whatever baggage you have, whatever hurting you have, whatever traumas you have, listen, God loves you. You are enough. You have always been enough, and He is for you. And Jesus has done everything necessary to defeat the circumstances that stand in your way, that prevent you from seeing the promise, and that have robbed you of the courage to approach the throne of God. Instead, we sit in our fears and our anxieties, and we no longer have to, because God has done everything necessary to free us and liberate us from those things. Jesus has died on the cross so that you can have life and life indeed. He said, "Come to me if you're weary and heavy laden. I will give you rest." David gave the Israelites a place of rest. He was a fighter. We get to see this later. I don't know how many stories we go through David. Like, his whole legacy was really getting the Israelites set up to be in a sense of peace as a nation. And they ultimately see that through Solomon, his son. Everything that Jesus did while He walked on this earth, listen, was so that you could have peace. So that we could be vessels of peace, that we could take this peace to others, because there are people all around us. The world is just falling apart, tattered flags, and yet we can be the peace and the calm in the storm by taking the gospel. Because that's what the gospel is. The gospel is a story of peace and love and forgiveness. And it all culminates in this man named Jesus. So what's the main takeaway? The main takeaway is this: David and Goliath foreshadow a greater truth. Jesus has defeated sin and death through His crucifixion and resurrection. And just as David's defeat of Goliath liberated the people of Israel from the fear of their enemy, Jesus has done everything necessary to liberate us from our enemy and restore us into the promises of God. And as far as application, and we'll end with this, I would just challenge you to begin to recognize the gospel threads throughout the Bible. This book is amazing with how it complements itself from book to book, from verse to verse, from chapter to chapter, like beginning to end. It is a logical book. It makes sense. It doesn't contradict itself. It supports itself. And it's done that for thousands and thousands of years. Recognize the gospel threads throughout it. Trust that God is bigger than your circumstance. You know, perspectives matter. We talked about this a moment ago. The army had a perspective that caused them to have fear and anxiety against the same enemy that David had confidence and courage. What's the difference? It's how we see God ultimately as sovereign and in control. Good or bad, God is greater. And lastly, I would just ask you to take courage in the faithfulness of God. The fact is your faith will probably fail you at some point. And that's okay, because listen, life is hard. There are moments where every one of us are shaken in our faith a little bit. We fail, we make mistakes, we do all these things. But here's what I never want us to lose our trust in, is God is always faithful. We are imperfect, and we should strive every day to lean into our faith more and more and more, to grow in our faith more and more and more. But the fact is, every single one of us will live this imperfectly at some point. We will make mistakes, and I want you to give yourself a little bit of grace. We lean back into God, because God has not rejected you or ran from you, even when you fail. Listen, the Israelites, they struggled in their faith, right? Did they lose their courage? Yes or no? Yes, they lost their courage. Did God deliver them? God is faithful, even when we are imperfect. That should give us hope today, because I know that there will be a day this week where I will live out my faith imperfectly. But I also know that I have a God that loves me even when I live out my faith imperfectly. And that reminds me to get back up, to lean back in, to surround myself with people that love him, and to rest in the peace and love that he has promised, because God is faithful even when I am imperfect. So take courage. God loves you and he's faithful. All right, the worship team's going to come. They're going to lead us in worship. We're going to go to communion and time of worship and prayer. So I'll pray us, but I want to pray for us to lead us into this. But the communion, we have the crackers and the juice, and we have some prepackaged items as well. But essentially, here's what I want us to think about. Just like David was the type that put us forward, looking forward to what Jesus was about to do, communion is kind of like that as well, right? We approach communion that the cracker represents the body of Jesus and the juice represents the blood that was poured out for us. The body broken and the blood poured out so that we can have life in him. So whenever we approach communion, it's not just cracker and juice, but we're literally coming up to it, reminding ourselves and responding in such a way as if we are reflecting deeply that, Jesus, this is really all about you. And I'm looking back to what you've done. I'm looking into what you are still doing. And I'm looking forward to the promises that lie ahead. This is everything. This is you for me, for my life, for my eternity. You've done everything necessary. So we approach this as followers of Christ to remember who Jesus is and was and always will be. Let's pray. God, thank you for who you are. You are so, so good to us. There is no one quite like you. And God, thank you for stories like David and Goliath that remind us of how easy it is to fall prey to our circumstances and to live in our fears. And God, yet how faithful you are that you've sent someone to intercede for us. You've sent an advocate. You've sent someone on our behalf that we can have life and victory and promise. And God, it is in his name that we pray, in the name of your Son, Jesus, that died for us and lived for us. God, thank you for him. Lead us into deeper faith. Cause us to have more meaningful rest and peace, and help us to make disciples every step that we go. In your name we pray.